Welcome to Occult Archives, where, well, we dig into the myths and legends behind history's most feared books.
From mystical grimoires to ancient secrets, the kind that are maybe too dangerous to read.
I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into the superstitions of witchcraft.
That's right. Episode 261, Cursed Beliefs, Forbidden Faiths, and the Hidden Theology of the Witch Hunts.
We've got some really fascinating historical texts to go through.
Yeah, tons of perspectives on how these superstitions began, how they're tied up with religion and social structures.
And how, like, reason eventually started to push back against them.
Kind of like a guided tour through the really dark history of witchcraft beliefs.
Okay, so first things first, superstition, right? Our sources are saying it's not just some quirk of primitive cultures. It's way more universal than that.
Right. It's like, we don't understand things. We're afraid of the unknown, so we invent supernatural explanations.
That makes sense. It's a way to explain things we can't immediately see or understand, like,
Yeah.
why bad things happen or what causes natural disasters.
And the sources say even science can't completely get rid of it. It's this constant battle between reason and imagination and ignorance.
So no matter how much we learn, there's always going to be that part of us that looks for answers beyond the physical world.
Yeah, the text even mentions this guy, J.S. Mill. He had this idea of three stages of speculation: supernatural, metaphysical, and scientific.
Okay, and what do those stages mean exactly?
Well, like the supernatural stage is all about explaining things through gods and spirits.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then you move into the metaphysical stage where you're trying to find explanations in abstract concepts and principles.
So it's getting a bit more philosophical.
Exactly. And finally, you get to the scientific stage where you're using observation and experimentation to figure things out.
So it's like moving from myth to reason.
Right. But the thing is, Mill's model, it doesn't really apply to everyone. Most people aren't, philosophers.
Right.
They're stuck in those earlier stages of thinking, especially if those beliefs are tied to fear and cultural norms.
That's actually kind of scary when you think about it, because it means that those supernatural explanations can stick around even when there's scientific progress.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Like, think about the witch hunts.
Right. The devastating consequences of actually believing in witchcraft, the text calls it a horrid and absurd phenomenon.
And the numbers are truly horrifying. They say like 9 million people were burned or hanged for witchcraft.
9 million. That's just unimaginable.
And it wasn't just during one period of history.
No.
It goes all the way back to before Christianity even.
And then it was picked up by early Christians.
Yeah, and then things really took off under the Catholic and Protestant churches.
It says here that the period between 1484 and 1680 was basically an era of devil worship.
Right, like people really believed evil was winning, like in that Zoroastrian idea of the cosmic battle between good and evil.
But here's the thing, right? The most intense witch hunts were happening during the Enlightenment.
I know, alongside people like Newton and Locke. It's mind-blowing, right?
It's like even with all that intellectual progress, these deep-seated beliefs just wouldn't go away.
I mean, it really shows how deeply rooted those beliefs can be. So, I mean, how did those beliefs get so strong,
Well, the text says that authority and custom played a huge role.
Yeah. Like if the people in power and everyone around you believes something, it's really hard to question it.
Even if you see things that contradict those beliefs.
Exactly. Even Blackstone, a legal scholar, was still talking about witchcraft. Yeah.
Even though it was already declining in his time.
Yeah, it shows how much those legal precedents stuck around. And England didn't even repeal its anti-witchcraft laws until the mid-reign of George II.
So it wasn't just like fear and paranoia driving these witch hunts. There were actual laws and social structures upholding them.
Exactly. Okay, so where did these beliefs even come from?
Well, the text goes back to ancient times, talking about the origins of witchcraft and diabolism.
Right. It says it's rooted in early religious feelings and superstitions, like fetishism.
Fetishism?
Yeah, it's basically the belief that certain objects have magical powers.
Like lucky charms and amulets.
Exactly. And then you have what they call sublimer magic associated with ancient Chaldea and Persia.
What's so special about Chaldea and Persia?
Well, they were some of the first places to really cultivate magic. They were known for their Divination and incantation skills.
Divination, like fortune-telling.
Yeah, pretty much.
Mm.
And the text says that even Cicero praised their skills, but the Jewish prophets, they condemned them.
So magic was already a controversial topic back then.
Oh, yeah. The story of Daniel in the Bible, that takes place in Chaldea, right? And it shows how valued those magical skills were. And then you have the Assyrians who they worshipped celestial bodies.
And the Persians had this idea of dualistic deities, good and evil.
Right. So all these ancient beliefs about unseen forces, both good and bad, they kind of laid the groundwork for later ideas about demons and witchcraft.
So those early ideas about the supernatural and magic were passed down through history and eventually morphed into the witchcraft beliefs we're talking about.
Exactly. Now, what about the Bible and early Christianity?
Well, the Bible itself talks about sorcery and witchcraft, right?
Oh, yeah. And it condemns them, which really solidified the belief that they were real and evil.
It says here that only the Sadducees, a Jewish sect, denied the existence of demons.
Right. Which means that most people back then, including early Christians, believed in them. And there's that story in Josephus about Eleazar,
No, I don't think I'm familiar with that one.
He's this guy who performs an exorcism in front of the Roman Emperor Vespasian. Yeah, it shows how common exorcisms were in Palestine at the time.
And everyone believed it was real.
Pretty much.
That's incredible. The text also mentions some Hebrew words like chashaf and pharmakeia.
Right. Some scholars say they directly refer to magic, which strengthens the idea that the Bible condemns witchcraft.
That's interesting. And then there's the fact that even Jesus was accused of being a juggler and wizard.
Right. It shows how easily people threw around accusations of sorcery back then.
Okay, so we've got these ancient beliefs and then the Bible condemning witchcraft. And then the text makes this argument about the church deliberately confusing witchcraft with heresy.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold claim. They're saying that the church used witchcraft accusations to punish people who disagreed with them.
Kind of like a way to silence dissent.
Exactly. If you disagreed with the church, you were not only a heretic, but also a devil worshiper.
And they actually have evidence for this.
Yeah. They point to groups like the Stediners, Paulicians, Albigenses, and Waldenses.
I'm not familiar with those groups.
They were all labeled as heretics, and they were often accused of witchcraft as well.
So the church was basically using the fear of witchcraft to control people.
It's a pretty disturbing thought.
Okay, so now let's move on to medieval science. The text says it was closely connected to superstition.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine now, but back then science and magic were kind of intertwined.
How so?
Well, they didn't really understand things like physiology, so they came up with these wild beliefs about lycanthropy and demoniacal possession.
Lycanthropy, like werewolves.
Exactly. And they used the story of Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible to support those beliefs.
Interesting. And demoniacal possession was that was taken seriously by doctors and religious authorities?
Oh, yeah. They had no other way to explain things like mental illness or seizures.
Wow. The text also mentions the Templar trials.
Right. Those were a big deal. They kind of kicked off the witch hunts in France.
So it was like a chain reaction.
Pretty much. The whole atmosphere was just like fear and suspicion. It was easy to accuse someone of witchcraft and have them be believed.
And what were some of the most famous cases of witchcraft accusations?
Well, there's Jeanne d'Arc, of course.
Oh, yeah, the French heroine.
But the English, they accused her of heresy and sorcery.
Really? Why would they do that?
It was all political. They couldn't beat her in battle, so they used witchcraft accusations to discredit her.
That's just messed up.
It is. They said she used a magically consecrated standard and attended witches' sabbaths.
Witches' sabbaths.
Yeah, we'll get to those later. But basically, they just threw everything they could at her.
And then there's the Duchess of Gloucester and Jane Shore in England.
Right. Those cases show how witchcraft accusations could be used in political power struggles.
So it was a way to get rid of your enemies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the persecution at Arras, which was really bad.
What happened at Arras?
It was a massive witch hunt. Lots of people were accused and executed.
That's terrible. Okay, so now let's talk about the Malleus Maleficarum.
Oh yeah, the witch hammer. That's a big one.
It was like the ultimate guide to witchcraft, right?
Right. It was written by Springer, Gremper, and Insteter, and it basically became the handbook for witch hunters.
And what did it say exactly?
Well, it was divided into 3 parts. The first part described what witchcraft was, the second part talked about the harm witches could do, and the third part outlined the remedies.
So it was like a complete guide to identifying, prosecuting, and punishing witches.
Exactly. And it was full of really messed up stuff. Like they said you could use torture to get confessions, and that a lack of tears during an accusation was a sign of guilt.
That's crazy.
I know, right? And they even said that criminals and other witches could be used as witnesses.
So basically, anyone could accuse anyone else of witchcraft.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the Males Maleficarum shifted the jurisdiction for witchcraft trials to the church.
So the church had even more power over these cases.
Exactly. And that's why the witch hunts got so bad after the book was published.
Wow. Okay, so what about demonology? What did people believe about the devil back then?
Well, they basically combined pagan, oriental, and Christian ideas.
So it was a real mix of different beliefs.
Yeah. And they imagined the devil with horns, hooves, and a tail.
Like the classic image of the devil we see today.
Exactly. But they also believed he could appear as a handsome man to seduce women.
So he was a real shapeshifter.
Yeah, pretty much. And there were all these explanations for his appearance. Like Sir Thomas Browne said the devil had hooves because he often appeared as a goat.
A goat. That's pretty weird.
I know, right? And then Chaucer, in his Friar's Tale, he has a devil who explains that they can take on all sorts of forms.
So the devil was a real master of disguise.
Yeah, and he wasn't just a tempter. They believed he could actually interfere in people's lives.
How so?
Well, there were the incubus and succubus demons.
What are those?
The incubus was a male demon who visited women in their sleep, and the succubus was a female demon who visited men.
And people believed these were real encounters.
Oh, yeah. They were often used as evidence in witch trials. And there were even stories about incubus demons disguising themselves as religious leaders.
That's pretty creepy.
It is. It shows how much people feared demonic influence. And then there were the witches' Sabbaths.
What were those exactly?
There are these secret meetings where witches were said to gather and worship the devil.
And where did these meetings take place?
Usually in remote locations like crossroads, mountaintops, or forests.
And what did they do at these Sabbaths?
Well, they were said to have mock sermons, orgies, and even baptize new members with the devil's mark.
So it was like a dark inversion of Christian rituals?
Exactly. And they believed the devil himself would appear at these Sabbaths, sometimes in different forms.
That's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, it was all part of the fear and moral outrage surrounding witchcraft.
Now, the text says that witch hunts weren't the same everywhere in Europe.
Right, some regions were hit harder than others.
Like Germany, for example.
Yeah, they had a lot of religious conflicts at the time, and their landscape, with all the forests and mountains, probably fueled the imagination.
So a combination of social and environmental factors.
Exactly. And then you have France, Spain, Italy, England, and Scotland. Each had their own unique approach to witchcraft.
And what about England specifically?
Well, they had their own witchcraft legislation. The first laws came about in 1541.
And what did those laws say?
Well, at first, during the reign of Henry VIII, it was mostly about punishing people for politically dangerous prophecies.
So witchcraft was tied to treason?
Yeah, kind of. And then under Elizabeth I, there was a renewed concern about witchcraft. Bishops were publicly complaining about it.
So it was becoming a bigger problem?
Yeah, and then James came along. He was a big believer in demonology.
Demonology?
Yeah, the study of demons. He even wrote a book about it called Demonology.
So he was really into this stuff.
Oh, yeah. And his beliefs influenced the Witchcraft Act of 1604, which really ramped up the persecution of witches in England.
But even with all this belief and persecution, there were people who doubted the existence of witchcraft, right?
Yeah, there were a few brave souls who dared to speak out, like Reginald Scott, for example.
What did he do?
He wrote a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, where he argued that witchcraft wasn't real.
Wow, that was pretty risky back then.
There was. He said that supposed magical acts were just tricks or natural phenomena that people didn't understand.
So he was basically trying to debunk the myths surrounding witchcraft.
Exactly. But his book was condemned and burned by James I.
That's pretty harsh.
It is. And there were others like Johann Weyer and Gabriel Naudet who also questioned the existence of witchcraft.
But their voices were mostly drowned out by the dominant beliefs.
Yeah, it was hard to go against the grain back then.
Now, the text talks about the issue of confessions obtained through torture.
Yeah, that's a A really dark chapter in this whole story.
It's hard to even imagine the cruelty that was inflicted on people.
The text says that these confessions were completely unreliable. People would say anything to stop the pain.
And Jean Baudin, he actually argued that normal legal standards shouldn't apply to witchcraft trials.
Yeah, which basically meant that anyone accused of witchcraft was uh, pretty much guaranteed to be convicted.
That's just insane.
It is. And there were all these stories about witches confessing to really bizarre things, like being transported to Sabbaths while their bodies were unconscious.
That sounds more like a dream or a hallucination than reality.
Exactly. But people believe it because it fit into their pre-existing beliefs about witchcraft.
And some of the accusations were really horrific, like infanticide and cannibalism.
Yeah, they said that witches would kill children and use their bodies for their rituals.
That's just sickening.
It is. Shakespeare even referenced these fears in Macbeth with the finger of birth-strangled babe.
Right, right. And the text gives us a specific example with the Warboys Witches trial in 1593.
Yeah, that's a well-documented case.
Yeah.
It involved the Samuel family being accused of bewitching the Throgmorton family.
And what happened in that trial?
Well, the old woman, Mother Samuel, she confessed, but it was probably under duress. And then Sir Samuel Cromwell, he was so disturbed by the whole thing that he founded a lecture on witchcraft.
So even though he believed in witchcraft, he was troubled by the way the trial was conducted.
Yeah, it shows that even people who believe in witchcraft could see that things weren't always right.
And then there's the strange fits that Jane Throckmorton had.
Right, she's the one who accused Mother Samuel. But those fits, they could have been caused by anything.
So it's another example of flimsy evidence being used to convict someone.
Exactly. And the text also mentions some historical figures who practiced magic, like John Dee and William Lilly.
John Dee, he was the one with the crystal ball, right?
Yeah, he was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. He was really into alchemy and astrology.
And William Lilly?
He was a 17th century astrologer who made political prophecies.
So magic wasn't always seen as evil?
Right. For some people, it was more about knowledge and power.
Okay, so eventually belief in witchcraft started to decline, right?
Yeah, slowly but surely. As science progressed and people became more skeptical, the witch hunts started to die down.
It says here that by the late 17th century, acquittals in witch trials were becoming more common.
Right, thanks to judges like Lord Chief Justice Holt, who insisted on higher standards of evidence.
So he was basically pushing back against the superstitions of the time.
Exactly. And even Louis XIV in France, he started commuting death sentences for witchcraft.
But the text says that belief in witchcraft persisted among the common people.
Oh yeah, those beliefs were hard to shake.
And then there was the Swedish witch panic in Mora in 1669.
Yeah, that was a bad one. All these kids were saying they'd been taken to Blockula for satanic rituals.
Blockula.
It's like a mythical place where witches were said to gather.
And people believe these kids.
They did. It led to the execution of a bunch of adults and children.
That's just awful.
It is. And then, of course, there were the Salem witch trials in America.
Right. That's probably the most famous witch hunt of all time.
Yeah, it happened in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts.
And what caused that?
Well, there were a lot of factors. The colonists were already predisposed to believe in witchcraft. They were having conflicts with Native Americans, and some prominent figures like Cotton Mather were really pushing those beliefs.
Cotton Mather, wasn't he a preacher?
Yeah, he's a big believer in witchcraft, and the trials were a mess. They used spectral evidence, which was basically just dreams and visions.
So basically, you could be convicted based on someone's imagination?
Pretty much. And people were pressured to confess. Even a minister who questioned the trials was executed.
So it was a really dark time for Salem.
It was. But even after the Salem trials, belief in witchcraft continued into the 18th century.
Really?
Yeah, there was the execution of Maria Renata, a nun in Germany, in 1749. And even in the 19th century, there were still cases of people being attacked because of witchcraft accusations.
So it took a really long time for those beliefs to completely fade away.
It did. And the text concludes by saying that superstition is just a part of human nature. It can pop up in different forms even today.
That's kind of depressing.
It is. It shows that we're still susceptible to fear and irrationality.
Well, I guess it's a reminder to always be critical of what we hear and to not give in to fear and prejudice.
Exactly. We have to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end on.
It is. but it's an important one.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the superstitions of witchcraft. It's been a fascinating and disturbing journey.
It has. But hopefully it's given our listeners something to think about.
And hopefully we've learned something from the mistakes of the past.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.